Chris Tron for KaijuPop.com, and welcome to this video month in gaming history. And as we look back to November of 1994, it was a busy month for Sega, bringing two consoles out to market in different territories. The first, the 32X, which came out in Europe and North America in November 1994, was born out of and killed by a rift between Sega of Japan and Sega of America. The 32X was developed by SOA under a very tight deadline, the machine having been announced at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show and then released in November of the same year. But it had actually been knocking around for a fair old while. This was designed to be a cartridge-based update to the Mega Drive system, said to bring it from 16 bits up to 32, and was sort of set to be released in two flavors: an addition, an upgrade to the 32X, this tumescent lump that did eventually get released, and a separate standalone console called the Neptune that would be able to play both Mega Drive and 32X carts. That never appeared or never hit shelves, but there are prototype units banging around and extremely rare and extremely valuable. So the 32X itself, it was kind of a sort of hardware accelerator, really. It contained 32-bit processors and 3D accelerators and whatnot. It plugged into the top of the Genesis or Mega Drive. It needed a whole extra power source on top of the one you had for your Mega CD and the one you had for your Mega Drive itself. And even if you were playing it on an original Genesis or Mega Drive, required an extra cable to go into the two. So you had this horrible mess of plastic and wires dangling off this thing. Not exactly appealing, and a big problem, really, from a consumer standpoint. This was an expensive upgrade, especially when the market was getting crowded already with kind of not great sort of quote-unquote next-gen systems, 3DO, Jaguar, things like that were half steps, Amiga CD32. And a lot of the market, kind of was suspicious of this, didn't want to keep their 16-bit systems going. It was supposed to be an affordable upgrade, but it really kind of wasn't. And people knew that both PlayStation was coming in the coming months, and so was Sega Saturn. The thing is, when Sega of America were developing the 32X, they didn't know that Sega Saturn was under development, and that sort of created an even wider rift between the two parts that probably hamstrung marketing for the Sega Saturn and basically killed both systems. But we'll look at Sega Saturn in just a few minutes. The 32X launched in Europe on November the 15th at a price of £169.99, and in America a week later, November 22nd, at the cost of $160. If you kind of thought that the market was already confusing for consumers thinking about getting a 32X, it was even worse in Japan, where, as we'll see, the Sega Saturn released on November the 22nd, a day after the 32X launched in the States, and the 32X actually came out in Japan after the Sega Saturn did. So there really wasn't a demand, well, there wasn't a demand anywhere for the 32X, but especially not in Japan, where it was called the Super 32X. It fell flat on its face, basically, and it's a very rare machine to find, especially in Japan. The machine actually launched with 2 games, so not a great lineup, and that library would be expanded to 40 by the time the thing was discontinued. Star Wars Arcade, which many hail as the best game on the system, but it's kind of, it's a pretty, there's quite a lack of competition in that. But, a reasonable enough, if bland, kind of 3D shooter. And also Doom, because Doom was appearing on consoles all over the place at the time. And Doom 2 had actually just come out on PC. But it wasn't the best version of Doom. It was letterboxed, and it came with just horrible bastardized versions of the original music, because the system had to rely on Genesis sound hardware, which was really getting on by this point. So for all sorts of reasons, the 32X wasn't the system to buy in November 1994, but maybe Sega's other hardware would fare better? So on to Sega's other and rather more well-known release of November 1994, the Sega Saturn, which came out in Japan on November the 22nd. The Sega Saturn has a few key figures attached to it, and the most important people behind its development were Sega CEO Hayao Nakayama, Tom Kalinske, who was the head of Sega of America at the time, and Hideki Sato, who was the director of R&D at Sega and oversaw development of the Saturn. The Saturn actually started development around 1992, which is around the time where Sega were making inroads into 3D, their Model 1 arcade architecture having powered Virtua Racing in 1992, and would go on to power Virtua Fighter towards the end of 1993, and Daytona USA at the start of 1994. Sega wanted to make a console that was built off of Model 1 architecture and allow them to easily port some of their 3D arcade games into the home. And Sega were doing well in both America at the time, with Kalinske being able to make a fair few changes that really meant the Genesis was taking off very, very well in America, with games like Sonic the Hedgehog being bundled in with the system. And in Japan, they were doing well in their arcade business. So development began to grow apace into building up a new console, but there was lots of conflicts between Sega of Japan and Sega of America, as we've heard already in this video. Japan and Sato wanted a dual CPU architecture system, which Kalinske fought against, and Kalinske actually went out and sought out other partners to work with Sega to produce their new console. Kalinske talked to Silicon Graphics, and Sega of Japan nixed that, and Silicon Graphics would go on to work with Nintendo for what would become the Nintendo 64. Kalinske also was in talk with Sony. Sony had just been ditched by Nintendo on their Nintendo PlayStation CD-ROM project, and Sony wanted to go out and make their own system. And Kalinske was in talks with Sega to partner with that for a combined console. Sony, well, their plan got nixed as well, and we'll talk more about Sony next month. Sega would eventually partner with Hitachi to co-produce some processors and things for the Sega Saturn architecture, but it was a rough ride to release. The system was all but done when suddenly in early 1994 Sony unveiled their PlayStation at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show, and it pretty much blew what the Saturn was doing out the water. So in a hurried, frenzied attempt to keep pace, Sega ordered a whole bunch of new 3D graphics and a new processor to go into the Saturn in conjunction with what was already there. At the same time, well, actually just slightly earlier, in 1993, the Jaguar and the 3DO coming out well in advance of what was happening with the Saturn, that spooked Nakayama. Nakayama ordered Tom Kalinske to go ahead and release or work on a stopgap at Sega of America. That stopgap would become the 32X, and as we've heard, a lot of the 32X development team was unaware that the Saturn was just about to come out and scupper them. Back in Japan, then, the number of cooks in the kitchen from a technical standpoint meant the Sega Saturn was notoriously difficult to develop for. And even though there were people that talk about how many failings the machine had from a 3D standpoint, it was actually not too shabby. It took the unusual step of rendering 3D objects in squares rather than triangles, and that meant with limited processing punch, they were able to offer more rounded surfaces that looked more convincing than if you were traditionally just building 3D objects from triangles, which is what other hardware did. The problem is that was what other hardware did, and so it became difficult to convert that into, a Sega Saturn game. It was very, very difficult for third parties to convert their games to the Sega Saturn, even though in 3D it was no slouch, and eventually later on there would be games that really showed off the potential potential of what the Sega Saturn could do, especially in terms of transparencies and things like that that people claimed the Sega Saturn wasn't capable of. In particular, there was a very, very, very good console interpretation of Quake that appeared on the Sega Saturn. The Saturn was really a 2D powerhouse though, and that was borne out by the fantastic fighting games and shmups that appeared on the system. And that 2D power, coupled with some interesting Sega first-party efforts, meant that the Saturn really wasn't the failure in Japan that it was in the West, and it was a failure in the West. My favourite line was from Arcade Magazine that was around in the late 90s in the UK that said, after the Saturn was discontinued, that the Sony PlayStation basically pissed on the Saturn from a great height. But in Japan, it was those sort of great 2D games and some interesting first-party titles that really carried it through to a, well, comfortable second place behind the PlayStation, but definitely ahead of the N64 back east. It also didn't suffer in Japan from the same lack of, well, decent communication and direction from Sega's marketing department in the West. And, well, Sega's marketing for the Saturn was really pretty lacking in the US and the UK. In Japan, we had fantastic Sega ads. I mean, after all, the Saturn brought us the infamous Sega Saturn. But that was long after launch. In the meantime, Sega Saturn launched in Japan on November 22nd at a price of 44,800 yen and alongside 5 launch titles. Virtua Fighter led the way, a conversion of the arcade game, but a really, really rushed port and a terrible, infamously bad home interpretation of an arcade game that really didn't set the Saturn in good stead. In fact, it was so poor that a remixed version, Virtua Fighter Remix, had to come out the following year, and actually users in America could actually trade their original Virtua Fighter copies in for remix at no extra cost. Such was the status of the original Virtua Fighter port. There was also Tama, Mysterious Ball in Giddy Kingdom, which was a kind of tilty maze game. Mahjong Goku Tenjiku, which was, well, it was a Mahjong game, because you have to have a Mahjong game at a Japanese console launch. There was Myst, which had come out a couple of years prior on PCs, but was already gaining traction and had a very strong Japanese following. And finally, One Chai Connection, which was a CG-driven puzzle adventure game. Nothing special there. So, not the most amazing of launch lineups, but the Sega Saturn would get going into a solid second place follow-up. But the generation was undisputedly won worldwide by a little system that would come out at the start of December. But that's next month's story.